welcome everyone to this panel talking about COP26. We've got a range of speakers, some similar backgrounds and some different ones as well. And really what we want to touch on is a combination of issues around law, innovation and science, and how those fit into COP26 given the current context of discussions over there. So I want to start with a big picture question for everyone around COP26. What's happening there, what we expect to happen next, what some of the desirable outcomes would be and what they look like. So hand over first to Jennifer Nichols.
Kia ora koutou. My name is Jennifer Nichols. I'm a councillor at the Waikato Regional Council and I represent the community of Hamilton. In my background, I have been a scientist by training at the University of Waikato, having then worked at the Auckland Cancer Society Research Centre and then moved on to Fonterra to be an environmental manager before moving into the councillor role now. So I've had a bit of a science and environmental management and now policy and local government background. Around COP26, I mean, I won't list out the things that can be, read about in the news about what's all the things that's happening there just now. But I do want to say that, some people are quite fatigued about the fact that there are this many conference of parties, number 26 on this topic. But at the same time, I'm really optimistic based on what I've learned so far about the process. So the Paris Agreement being signed in 2015, having a lot more structure built into it to allow the targets that being set to actually need to be delivered upon. So the exciting thing about this COP in particular is that it's the fifth one after the Paris Agreement. So that means that the national determined contributions have been announced, where each country says how much they can do by a certain point in time. And then after that, what will happen is that they'll be held accountable to that and audited to that. And the idea is that these will get increased over time. So where we're at the moment, from what I could hear, is prior to COP26, all the nationally determined contributions were set at something like possibly a 2.7 degree temperature increase, and whereas now they're talking about an average of about 1.8. So since one of the big benefits of COP26 is to keep 1.5 degrees alive, it's definitely making some progress, but there will be definitely more needed. So I'm just really hoping that the people there keep doing what they're doing while everybody else is getting to know climate change in their everyday lives, in their workplace, how they relate to it, and doing what they can in their little puzzle piece of the giant picture that we need to build in order to bring it all together. And that includes the small things that people do in their lives to show the demand to help the market move as the large forces at COP26 meet the bottom up. So yeah, I'm really excited that it's getting somewhere. I'll just pass on to the next person.
Thank you, Jennifer. Over to Nick.
Kia ora koutou. Yeah, I'm Nathan Cooper. I'm a associate professor at Tipperary at the University of Waikato, Faculty of Law. I work in sort of my research areas around human rights and environment, and I'm really interested in legal theory and how theories can be sort of brought to bear on practice and help us sort of look at new perspectives, new ways of tackling the sort of challenges that we're facing. And obviously one of the biggest challenge, the most existential challenge that we're facing at the moment is around climate change, and that's what COP is all around and all about. I suppose a little bit different to Jennifer. I'm a little bit disappointed about where we're up to in terms of COP26 at the moment. Following closely the preparation for the COP and then the first week, it feels a little bit of a roller coaster. There's been such a a level of anticipation, probably like never before, certainly not for the last couple of COPs, in terms of expectations. What's going to happen in the COP? This has been described as the last best hope, which really is somewhat hyperbolic, but maybe has got some truth in it as well. What are we going to find as the COP draws to a close in the next couple of days? And then there was a bit of optimism last week, and we saw those kind of big ticket, big headline grabbing initiatives around voluntary agreements on methane reduction, on deforestation and reforestation, etc. And some good news. India, for instance, one of the largest polluters at the moment, putting together a net carbon zero target by 2070, which was a bit of a surprise. So some optimism there, and now we're kind of coming over the cusp, and there's some pessimism as well, as those numbers are bandied around. 1.8 degrees seems to be the absolute best reading of the situation at the moment, and putting that into some perspective, the target of 1.5 is not an arbitrary target. It's essentially the least worst outcome. So the difference between the consequences of a world heated 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial level and 1.8 degrees is really significant. So even on the best reading, there's an awful long way to go before we can get a sense that we're on top of this, that this is in somehow under a level of control. In terms of the specifics, there's quite a lot of negotiation topics still to get through, and still an awful lot of really important decisions to be made. In terms of really important things for New Zealand and the consequences for New Zealand, as was alluded to, New Zealand's new nationally determined contribution, our new pledge on emissions reductions, been announced. It's more ambitious than the previous one, but in terms of the detail, how are we going to actually manage to meet that pledge? One of the ways that we're going to be able to do it is to use overseas activities. In other words, to be able to count in our own pledge what goes on outside of New Zealand. Now, in order to be able to do that, and to be able to do that with any certainty, we need the rules around overseas activities to be clear, and they're not clear from the Paris Agreement. They're vague, and they're still up for negotiation as we speak. So hopefully in the next couple of days we'll get a bit more clarity around that bit of the Paris Agreement, so that countries, not New Zealand is not unusual in that respect, but countries that will include in their plan operations that are offshore and emissions reductions activities that are outside of their country. These rules need to be clear so that we know, how do we count these? Are we double counting? Is there transparency and fairness in that system? The other big element for me, which is still undecided, is the question of so-called ratcheting. So the commitment currently is that countries party to the Paris Agreement are required every 5 years to come back and produce this nationally determined contribution. And the idea is that over time, the contributions become more sorry, I forgot, lost the word. They become
ambitious.
Ambitious, thank you, Barry. Fantastic. They become more ambitious, and they're not able to slip backwards. Now, even with 1.8 on the table as a best reading at the moment, there's considerable pressure from developing countries to go back to the table about the ratcheting clause, and actually to advocate for bigger polluting countries to have to come back and ratchet up their contributions possibly every year. Now, again, if there's any movement on that in negotiations, then that's going to have really significant consequences, but that could be a good thing in terms of really putting the pressure on. So a long way to go in what's still only a couple of days worth of negotiations, and I'm really hoping that the roller coaster will continue and it will kind of finish on a slightly more optimistic tilt. But I'll leave that there in terms of sort of first reflections and pass on.
Thank you, Nathan. Pass over to Dennis.
Yes, Marina. My name's Dennis Tegg. I'm a colleague of Jennifer's, the Thames Coromandel representative on the Regional Council. Practiced as a lawyer in Thames for 45 odd years, and has been heavily involved in issues relating to coastal hazards and adaptation around the Coromandel coast. Yeah, I tend to come down, I'm more on Nathan's and Jennifer's side in terms of my attitude to COP. As he said, it's been a bit of a roller coaster. I suppose my major concern is that really China and Russia are not part of the discussions. Certainly the leaders aren't there. My own feeling is that that governments really have to grasp that there is the technology to beat this problem, but if they get stuck in continuing to subsidise the legacy fossil fuel and partly agriculture production models, then we're not going to get there. But if they really grasp the nettle and put the investment into new technologies, and maybe this is something we can touch on later in the innovation section, then I think I'm much more optimistic about being able to get there. But Nathan mentioned the 1.8 degrees as perhaps the absolute best. And I just seen a discussion from Professor Tim Nash, and he's saying that the latest science on sea level rise is that if we tip over 2 degrees, then there is that's a tipping point beyond which sea level rise is basically irreversible, and we could then face potentially 2 metres by the end of the century, and then over millennium 15 to 20 metres. So you know, keeping under 2 degrees is absolutely essential, and you know, I'm a bit ambivalent about whether we're going to make it. On our own contribution, I think I share that concern. I'm disappointed in our position at the moment. There's a newsroom article, just looking at the headline, it says New Zealand goes from innovator to hand-wringer on climate, and I think that sums up my position relating to, you know, the government's contribution at this stage. You know, we won't even have our emission reduction plan for another 6 months, and it really should have been ready for this conference, I believe. And then we have, to take a legal look at things, Lawyers for Climate Action taking a judicial review against the Climate Commission and the Minister's, you know, budgets, carbon budgets, and basically citing there's actually a basic mathematical error in the way that our contribution has been determined. So, yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag for me, but you know, if we do grasp that nettle and really push on with investment in these available technologies, and I'm not talking about new ones that haven't been, you know, proven yet, then I think there's some sense of optimism. Thanks.
Thank you, Dennis, and we will return to some of those points as we go through. Hand over now to Sarah for initial comments.
Thanks, Thomas. Kia ora koutou. I'm Sarah Thompson. I'm a Hamilton City Councillor and also have a background in law. And some good comments have already been made, so I won't traverse back over that ground. But I would say from a local perspective, something I would like to see from this conference is New Zealand actually pressured to commit to more of its emissions being tackled here locally. I find the fact that we're looking at a large majority of our emissions being offset overseas quite concerning, and I think that what we need to be doing is looking at how we can improve well-being of people through climate action. So thinking here locally within Hamilton, we have so many opportunities to improve people's health and well-being, whether it be through a better transport system, which gives people more options, or more resilient, warmer homes and things like that. So at the moment, the government's action around climate change locally has been incredibly disappointing, and there's been lots of opportunities lost. For example, here in Hamilton, the council's really trying to make progress on things like cycleways and public transport, but because only 2% of the entire transport budget goes towards walking and cycling, it's meant that the pot's too small, and a lot of our projects which the community have supported and which we've put money into the long-term plan for have actually missed out on co-funding. And it kind of seems quite ironic that in a climate emergency we can't even get a few $1 million to progress some low carbon transport projects. So from a personal perspective, I'd like to see COP actually, I think there's talk about getting countries to commit to more of their emissions being domestic emissions reductions, and that's something that I think would be a huge benefit for people, along with, of course, reaching some kind of agreement which keeps us below at least that 1.8. Kia ora.
Thank you, Sarah. Some really good comments there about how New Zealand should respond. Hand over now to Barry Barton.
Yeah, kia ora tātou. I'm a lecturer, a professor at the Waikato Law School, and I work on energy, climate change, natural resources, and we now offer a course on climate change law, which is getting good uptake from our students. Let me reflect for a moment on the actual negotiations, what's going on. COP26 is important, as well, several of my colleagues here have said, because in some ways it is the last great hope. On the other hand, it is the 26th in a line of annual conferences since the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. So it is part of a process, and it is long and it's frustrating, and we won't get everything we need. But essentially, it is the world's way of dealing with a giant coordination problem, getting everyone more or less on side. So there have been successes and failures, and in international negotiations, sometimes procrastination is a virtue. It's better than an outright bloodbath. And sometimes ambiguity, creative ambiguity, is the best way that negotiators can find. So there will be a COP27 and a COP37, and goodness knows how many more. We just have to hope that the negotiators then and the people in the various countries behind them will be able to look back and say that their predecessors did a good job in the circumstances they were in. Three main things going on, really. First of all, the need for increased ambitions, and Nathan and Dennis in particular have touched on this. That is absolutely critical. So we will probably see efforts to concretize that. Second thing going on that actually, in some ways, I think is the central component of the negotiations, and the point on which everything else depends, and that is financial support for developing countries. The commitment in particular a while ago to $100 billion per annum, which sounds like a stupendous amount of money, but we're talking about the world as a whole. And it's necessary to meet conditional commitments that a lot of countries have made, but above all, to avoid a breakdown in trust. What has characterized climate change negotiations is incredible lack of trust between the developed and the developing worlds. And the developing worlds in particular has seen the whole thing as not so much an environmental matter as an equity, justice, and development matter. And that's cost us dearly. You can basically look at 15 years of lack of progress after Kyoto as being directly attributable to that total impasse. So the money for assisting developing countries to leapfrog old technologies into new ones, the money for what is called loss and damage, basically for adaptation, this is central. So it's good that New Zealand improved its performance. I expect there's still more to be done. The third thing is what's called the Paris Agreement Rulebook. There's a certain amount of detail in the Paris Agreement and the convention behind it, but there are hundreds of pages more detail needed to put these things into operations. And we've already touched on the emissions trading, international trading, and the uncertainty about using international units to offset our local obligations. Short point is, New Zealand has always depended on that under one government or another, and it's an unsatisfactory truth, but it is a truth. We used huge numbers of very dodgy units 10 years or so ago, and it caused the emissions trading scheme utterly to crash. It was on the basis of units that weren't worth a darn. They were plainly incapable of coming up to audit, to put it politely. The international community isn't going to let that happen again. So one of the awkward things is that if indeed the Article 6 negotiations result in a scheme for New Zealand and others to be able to buy units from overseas, then we will pay a pretty high price. They'll be good quality units, and everyone will be wanting them. So it won't actually be much of a get out of jail card. And in fact, what it will do is it'll make more clear we're paying some billions of dollars a year to countries overseas, and that will, I think, put the spotlight rightly on the sectors in New Zealand that are not doing their share of the lifting. Agriculture will have to come to the party in terms of biogenic methane, and it'll be pretty easy to work out how many billions of dollars of a cross subsidy there is there. So there are other aspects to the rule book, and James Shaw is involved in the transparency issues, which are essentially the audit, verification, reporting, monitoring. A lot of countries perfectly happy with that. New Zealand is in pretty good shape, but some countries like Russia and China, not very happy to supply huge amounts of detailed information about their industries to international fora. So those are the things that we'll be working on. Anyway, there's a few of the things I think that are important, and indeed we have to hope that our negotiators, our global negotiators, will do a good job in the next few days. Goodness knows how much sleep they will get, probably not much.
Thank you, Barry, for those comments. And before I segue on, I just wanted to make a few comments myself, first of all by way of introduction. So I'm Thomas Gibbons. I'm a practicing lawyer in Hamilton and a graduate in law and planning. So my interests are across property and resource management, and increasingly how those translate into the bigger issues that have been talked about. And it really strikes me that there's this mix of course, the international context and, of course, the local context. It's fairly trite to say that, but really interested in the comments about how those overlap and feed into each other in terms of how New Zealand is acting as an international citizen, what it is relying on others for, and how behaviours are driven and changed locally as well. And so we are obviously talking across broad issues of COP26 and also law, innovation and science. I'm going to make a brief comment on the limits of law, and one of those is highlighted in a recent court case which was brought by a member of the public, essentially interested in how a tort-based claim could be used against some of New Zealand's bigger companies to require them to take some greater action in respect of climate change indicators and response. And highlights the limits, I suppose, of the legal system sometimes when the court said this is an innovative idea but not the right approach. And that really reinforces that there's a need for policymakers and the community overall to respond rather than the courts. The courts are at times shrugging their shoulders on some of these issues. Or more generously, they're saying that courts are not the right approach. But really interested in bringing out some of the ideas and comments that people have both around law and around innovation. And I think to keep those moving promptly, we'll start with Dennis, who wanted to make some comments on innovation and feed in from there.
Okay, that's fine. Yes, thanks. Look, as I said earlier, I think there is existing technology to tackle the crisis, and I particularly refer to a report by a futurist called Tony Sieber, and he's part of a think tank called Rethink X, and he's just his group has put out a report on climate implications, and essentially he says there are three parts to innovation that are essential to this issue. It's basically energy, transport, and food, and these aren't. We saw at the regional council a talk by Paul Winton, and he referred to unicorns, and he was referring to sort of unproven technology. So these don't fall in that category, like carbon capture and storage, which is touted as a solution when really it's unproven. So these technologies are readily available now, and if I just touch on them sort of in turn. So on energy, we've got wind, solar, and large-scale battery storage, and the analysis from Sieber and others is that already the cost curve of those technologies has been impressive in the last 10 years, perhaps dropping around 70 or 80%. And the expectation is there's still another 70 or 80% to go by the end of this decade. And so that allows these three technologies, when they're combined, to basically provide enough power to run the global economy without using fossil fuels. So that's quite an exciting prospect. And in New Zealand, we've really been slow, I think, to adopt those technologies. I mean, there's actually quite a lot of wind power that's already consented under the RMA, but has never been built. And that's just showing a sort of a lack of ambition and investment. So I'm quite encouraged by that. And then his other second leg is basically the electrification of transport. And I know that electric cars aren't the only answer, and we have to have mode shift as well. And I know Sarah will no doubt talk to that. But what this report is saying on transport is that, again, there's an exponential cost curve that's been ridden down. And to give you one example of where I think we're not quite up with the play, the Climate Commission in its report has suggested that the sticker price parity between an EV and an internal combustion engine won't be reached until 2026. But I'm aware of a Chinese manufacturer is bringing out EVs to New Zealand next year, which will achieve price parity with an equivalent petrol or diesel car. So I think this change is going to happen a lot faster than many of the sort of business as usual pundits imagine. And in a way, it's not going to be the emission reduction of a vehicle that drives the change. It's going to be market forces. So that's encouraging as well. And then I hear you say, well, what about agricultural emissions? And we've been certainly slow to respond to that. But what's flying under the radar is a new food technology called precision fermentation. And Sieber and others are saying, and there's already plenty of examples of it out there, but again, there's a cost curve that can be ridden down where the projections of some of these people is that by mid-decade, there will be cost parity with making dairy protein in a vat compared to that from animal protein. And that by the end of this decade, it'll be 5 times cheaper. And by 2035, it will be 10 times cheaper. And so if that was to come to pass, then, I mean, on the one hand, that's very bad news for the dairy industry in New Zealand, but it could be very good news for global emissions reductions in agriculture. So, you know, those are some of the ideas out there that, if you look at this latest report from this Rethink X group, there is some reason for optimism. So, you know, I think this isn't really widely understood or known. I know many of my fellow councillors are unaware of these sort of the sort of exponential growth in the S-curve adoption of these new technologies that I appreciate aren't the whole answer, but they can certainly go a long way to it. So yeah, I'll leave that there. Thanks.
Thank you, Dennis. Yeah, interesting comments on the role of technology and innovation there. And interested, Sarah, in hearing from you about your comments on the role of not just innovation, but also law, perhaps, given your roles in that area.
Thanks, Thomas. Firstly, acknowledging what Dennis has said there, I think there are a few areas where we're seeing progress. So you've got technology coming through, and then there's the public pressure and being put on politicians, and then you have the legal side of things also putting pressure on them for that change. So I think all of them are important. I think that the legal approach does have limitations, like you said. For example, trying to take a tort claim can be difficult, particularly here in New Zealand. I think overseas it would have a better chance, but our courts are relatively conservative, and it can be very hard to link the actions of, say, one company to then the actual impacts of climate change, because it's so accumulative. You know, you've got actions from all over the world which together are causing these impacts on the climate. So that link can be hard to make. But there is a role for it. I think that things like judicial review are actually quite powerful, both in terms of creating public awareness of an issue and highlighting, say, a lack of ambition or a lack of action or poor decision making. And an example of that, you know, if you think of the Regional Land Transport Plan in Auckland, which is being challenged, and then the one in Waikato, which honestly probably should be challenged, you know, there was some poor decision making there where, for example, in the Waikato, we didn't even measure what the impact of a transport plan was going to have on emissions within the region. And so you can clearly say, well, hold on, that was a critical consideration you should have taken into account. And by, say, taking an action against that, your officials and people making decisions will take that into account and improve what they're doing. And I think that on the broader scale, if you look at things like Mill Road in Auckland, that pressure there that was put on decision makers by, I think it was the All Aboard group, I think must probably also had a real impact on decisions to scale back what was going to be a transport project that induced more driving and emissions. So there's definitely a place there for taking legal action to bring about change, but the courts prefer an incremental approach. They're not, particularly here in New Zealand, they really are willing to make a decision that kind of turns everything on its head and creates, I guess, a new principle that is very different to what the courts have enforced before that. So you can see that in the most recent case you mentioned, Thomas, where they said this is going too far from what we usually, I guess, adhere to when it comes to tort law.
Thank you, Sarah. So interested in the last few minutes on touching on a few comments around, again, the international and the local and how that fits into legal policy, market and community frameworks. So make of that what you will. Just wanted a few comments from you, Nathan, and then Jennifer, perhaps, just around some of those international issues translating into local actions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, really interesting kind of reflections in terms of what's possible in terms of legal innovation. I suppose one of the things that I find some comfort in is actually looking at what else is going on in other jurisdictions and then thinking about how that may or may not impact where we are now and here. And, you know, in terms of innovation, what we've seen in recent years in the field of law is a whole new wave of climate litigation, which is being used to really good effect in lots of different places, lots of different jurisdictions. So a couple of years ago, in the Netherlands, the Dutch court, the Dutch government was ordered to essentially take much more stringent steps to address emissions reductions as a result of litigation pushed forward by a climate environmental group. And the way in which that was argued was to link climate change and the effects of climate change on individuals to human rights, and in particular to rights under the European Convention of Human Rights around the right to life and the right to private and family life. So that's kind of one little example of where both litigators but also courts have been willing to take innovative steps in terms of pushing forward greater protections in response to climate change. We're seeing other emanations of that elsewhere in different ways through of linking rights and rights talk into constitutional provisions, both national constitutions, state constitutions. New York State just a couple of weeks ago added an amendment to their state constitution to acknowledge that everybody has the right to a healthy environment, to clean air, to clean water, and a healthful environment, as they termed it. And so there's little examples there on the horizon that really are quite new and have got the potential to not only encourage our own courts to be a little bit more progressive, but also to really galvanise public opinion and public support. And I'm particularly interested in that narrative of rights. Not to get too hung up on human rights, but I think there's something there that could be used to really good effect in terms of focusing our attention on what our rights are to a healthy environment and claiming those rights, not just for us, but also for our children and for future generations as well, because there's a sort of a power in that language and a power in that vocabulary. And it's also a vocabulary that we're kind of used to as well. So we bandy around sort of individual rights quite often. And so extending that to the field of environmental protection and thinking about what would a healthy environment look like and what would having a right to that healthy environment look like in practice, I think is an area that's really kind of fertile for exploring in terms of legal innovation. I'll leave that there because I'm aware that other people will want to chip in as well, but there's lots more where that came from in case we get a chance to come back.
Thank you, Nathan. I hope too. But no, really good comments there around rights and the role of language and so on, and on the court's response. So Jennifer, just interested in you picking up on the local action aspect of that and how international issues translate into local actions in particular from a council, which is both a community representative body and a regulatory body in some ways. So interested in some comments from you there before we wind up.
Well, thank you. I can see that the legal action that's been taken overseas is certainly ramped up, and I wouldn't be surprised at all, as a few others have commented, if that will increase here locally as well. And rightfully so in some ways, because when you look at the fact that climate change has been known about for such a long time, decades and decades, and even the quite shocking news that came out a while back about the fact that there are oil companies such as BP whose scientists were making these connections around climate change, and they really had a moment in time where they could have shifted their model, but actually chose to double down and extract as much oil as possible and do that for decades to come, and really just invest in lobbying to deny and delay action on climate change. I mean, there's an injustice there that I'd be hugely surprised if that was not to receive more attention in future. And I note that even just, with the case that was mentioned before about locally, how, there's a bit more narrative now on who are the biggest emitters in New Zealand. And they have, they're all large companies, some of them international companies. And so they have the resources and knowledge to do something on this. And they have a disproportional impact on our emissions profile compared to Joe Bloggs down the street, right? So really keen to see where that goes. But from if I think about the international parts around COP, I mean, I'm really grateful for Barry for just explaining my reasons for hope a little bit more. To be honest, I don't have any other choice than to be hopeful. The other alternative isn't something I like to think about. So. But it's actually been by doing this role in the regional council, even just the last 2 years, that I've learned to understand the legal processes, the policy processes to a degree where I have more hope than ever before, because ultimately these shifts of systemic shifts in our economy, etc., are not going to happen with a new system. We simply don't have time to create a new system. To then fix the problem, we need to work with the existing system and tweak it and shift it to fix the problem. And you can then call it a new system, but that's fine. And so on top of that, I think, especially when it comes to the very large emitters that are going to have to change the most, I think some of them are absolutely dreaming in regards to how long they believe they'll have the social license to actually do things the way that they do. I'd say that social perception on this topic is on an exponential curve also, and it has certainly been very slow over the past few decades, thanks to the forces I mentioned before, but that is increasing really rapidly. When I look at a couple of years to now, the amount of people that are talking about climate change, knowledgeable about climate change, demanding action on climate change locally and internationally, it's really hopeful. And so when you've got a process like COP26, the Conference of the Parties, you've got the Paris Agreement, and then that translates directly into the Zero Carbon Act here in New Zealand, which was, just want to give a big ups to Generation Zero who drafted that idea. I was a part of that group about a decade ago, to be able to make it easy for the government to kind of see a way forward with the community to develop that. And then that translating into the commitments under that of the National Emission Reduction Plan, which I really hope that lots of people are making submissions on right now, and the National Adaptation Plan. And then we are currently at the Regional Council working on a Regional Emission Reduction Plan and Regional Adaptation Plan. And so as we make this more and more local, the local action will happen. And so I think while that happens in a government space, the market obviously has to move, and the science and innovation will help with that, but a lot of it will actually not necessarily be technology. A lot of it will be simplifying our lives a bit, and just looking at whether there's a way that we can not sacrifice the things that are really important to us, but sacrifice the things that aren't, and be able to do them thanks to the market in a way that is cheaper than the and less desirable alternative, and solve a problem at the same time. So yeah, as long as we get that just transition right, between the market and the government policies coming together, I think it's entirely possible. But I'll let somebody else talk now.
Thank you, Jennifer. A lot of good comments on there. So, given the constraints of time, I was just going to touch on a few points that have been covered today. And there's obviously been a mammoth level of ground covered. Excuse the analogy here. the issues that have come up around rights and trust and what is happening internationally and what is happening locally, and from a lawyer's perspective, the role of the courts versus the role of central government, local government, international arrangements, the role of negotiators. There's also been useful comment, important comment on disappointment and ambivalence, but also optimism and hope. And I think, it's testament to our speakers today that such a great level of ground around regulation, around the market, around communities, international bodies, and everything in between is able to be covered. So, wanted to acknowledge the University of Waikato for hosting this panel, and particularly a shout out to its attention to this field and the new Bachelor of Climate Change. And also the university is fortunate enough to have people so knowledgeable in this area, such as Barry Barton and Nathan Cooper. So thank you to you both for your contributions. Also wanted to touch on the fact that we're well served in the Waikato locally by those with an interest in the topic at a local government level. So Sarah Thompson, thank you, and Jennifer Nichols and Dennis Tegg, also thank you. Both local and regional levels of government and in institutions like the university, there is this level of interest and attunement to these issues. And I think really just to wind up, there's been this important level of attention to not just what is happening internationally, but what is happening locally, and how what seem like small issues or small decisions locally can really make a big difference over time. And on that note, and with a thank you to all the panelists, just wanted to encourage everyone who's watching to go out there and do their bit as well. Thank you.
The University of Waikato is proud to introduce the world's first Bachelor of Climate Change for the people who know there is no Planet B. Gain the skills needed for the jobs of tomorrow. Contribute to a fundamental shift in the way we do business and go about our lives. Explore how Mātauranga Māori can bring perspective to the most pressing issue of our time. Apply now and carve a career where passion and purpose collide.